The Galactic Academic Consortium's orientation hall on Vareth Station smelled like recycled atmosphere and quiet condescension. Cadet Marcus Reyes stood in a line of 43 new students from 11 different species, holding a data slate he hadn't been given time to read, wearing a uniform that had been issued 30 minutes ago and still felt borrowed. Around him, other cadets chatted in clusters. The Drevithi pair with their luminescent throat markings, a lone Sketh who stood nearly 3 meters tall and drew glances from everyone, a group of 4 Orani whose hive mind coordination made them finish each other's sentences without pause. Marcus stood alone. Not because he was being excluded exactly. More because no one seemed to notice he was there. The intake assessor was a Professor Yeln Sovari, Drevithi, senior faculty, author of 14 published volumes on multi-species tactical theory. She moved down the line with the practiced efficiency of someone who had processed thousands of cadets and expected this batch to be no different. She paused at each student, scanned their credentials, asked a question or two, made a note. When she reached Marcus, she stopped. Looked at the data slate. Looked at him. "Human," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She read further. Marcus Reyes. Age 26. Submitted through the Seoul Defense Forces officer track. She tilted her head slightly. No prior academic citations. No published theory work. Your service record indicates. She paused. Patrol assignments. Frontier logistics. 1 commendation for supply chain optimization. That's correct. Your entrance exam scores were average, she said. Not unkindly. Just factually, the way you might read a weather report. Middle of the cohort. Nothing stands out. Marcus nodded. I understand. She looked at him for a moment longer than the others, and something in her expression was not cruelty but something adjacent to it. A professional dismissal, the kind that comes from experience and statistics. Most cadets that came through with profiles like his washed out by the 3rd semester. She'd seen it many times. You'll be assigned to strategic theory and multi-species command doctrine, she said. The seminar format requires active contribution. I'd encourage you to review the prerequisite materials before the first session. She moved on. Marcus stood in the same spot for a moment. The Drevithi cadets ahead of him were being praised for their biosignal aptitude scores. The Sketh cadet was being flagged as a possible candidate for the advanced combat theory track. He picked up his data slate and walked to his assigned quarters. The room was small and smelled like filtered air and someone else's prior occupation. He set his bag on the bunk, sat down, and opened the prerequisite reading list. It was 847 pages across 9 documents, expected to be completed before the first seminar in 4 days. He started reading. Not because he was trying to prove anything. Not yet. Simply because that was what the assignment required, and Marcus Reyes, whatever else he was, had always done what the assignment required. The station hummed around him. Somewhere down the corridor, the Orani cadets were laughing in synchronized waves. Through the viewport, the stars held their positions with the indifference they had always maintained. Marcus read until 0300 hours, took a 4-hour sleep cycle, and was back at his slate before breakfast. The first seminar met in a tiered discussion room that felt more like a tribunal than a classroom. Professor Sovari stood at the center with 2 assistant instructors, Professor Dace, a compact Sketh specialist in logistics warfare, and Professor Amiris, an elderly Orani scholar whose hive contribution made him appear to think in parallel streams simultaneously. The topic was the Keshri engagement of 2,400 cycles prior, one of the foundational case studies in multi-species fleet coordination, taught at every major military academy in the consortium. The question on the table was straightforward. Why had the Allied fleet's numerical advantage failed to produce a decisive outcome? Cadets raised hands. The Drevithi pair offered a cogent analysis about communication lag between species with different cognitive processing speeds. The Sketh cadet presented a structural argument about formation geometry under asymmetric sensor ranges. An Orani cadet referenced 3 academic papers from memory, citation perfect, in under 90 seconds. Professor Sovari guided the discussion with occasional interjections, clearly pleased with the quality of engagement. 40 minutes in, she turned her gaze across the room and it landed on Marcus. Cadet Reyes. You've been quiet. I've been listening, he said. And what have you concluded from what you've heard? He paused. Not from uncertainty, she would later note in her intake report, but from what appeared to be a brief mental reorganization, as though he was deciding which entry point to use. The analysis so far is technically correct, he said. Communication lag, formation geometry, sensor asymmetry, all real factors. But I think we're treating them as causes when they were symptoms. The room was quiet. The underlying problem, he continued, was that the Allied fleet was designed by committee. Every species contributed a module to a shared doctrine, but no one was actually in command. There was coordination but no command authority. When the engagement deteriorated and the situation stopped matching the plan, there was no single decision-maker empowered to deviate. Every species commander was waiting for consensus that never came. Professor Sovari said nothing for a moment. Her expression did not change. "That's a simplistic framing," said the Orani cadet who had cited the 3 papers. "Unified command doctrine has been theorized extensively. The literature consistently identifies implementation barriers." "I've read the literature," Marcus said. Not rudely. Just calmly. "The implementation barriers are real. But the literature theorizes the problem from the outside. I'm saying the Keshri commanders experienced it from the inside and didn't have language for what was killing them, so they wrote their after-action reports using the frameworks they had. That's why the communication lag explanation has stuck for 2,400 cycles. It's not wrong. It's just not the deepest answer." The Orani cadet opened his mouth and closed it. Professor Sovari looked at Marcus with an expression that had shifted by perhaps 3 degrees. Not admiration, not yet, but a slight recalibration of something. She made a note on her data slate. "Interesting framing," she said. "Unverifiable given available records, but interesting." She moved the discussion forward. That evening in her office she pulled up Marcus Reyes's file again. Supply chain optimization. Patrol assignments. Average entrance scores. She sat with it for a moment then closed it. One seminar did not make a cadet. She had learned that lesson many times in the other direction. Brilliant first impressions that collapsed under the weight of sustained rigor. She filed her note, flagged it as preliminary and turned to the next item on her agenda. Through the viewport of her office, the station's rotation brought a slow arc of stars into view, and then carried them away again. Professor Dace was the kind of instructor who believed that discomfort was a pedagogical tool. His seminar on logistics warfare met 3 times a week in a room with no chairs. A deliberate choice, he explained on the first day, because officers make decisions standing. His course was structured around a single premise. In any sufficiently complex conflict, the side that manages its supply chain better will win, regardless of tactical brilliance, numerical advantage, or individual heroism. War, in Dace's telling, was not poetry. It was arithmetic. Marcus found this refreshing. The course was also, by common agreement among the cohort, brutally difficult. Dace did not lecture in the traditional sense. He presented scenarios, incomplete, contradictory, resource-constrained, and asked cadets to solve them in real time, out loud, with the rest of the seminar watching. Errors were not penalized with grades. They were penalized with follow-up questions, each one more precisely aimed at the root of the error, until the cadet either found the mistake themselves or admitted they could not. 3 weeks into the semester, Dace presented a scenario that would later be discussed in the Academy's internal curriculum reviews. A fleet of mixed species was operating in a resource-depleted sector. Supply convoys were running 17 cycles behind schedule due to a combination of route degradation and interdiction pressure. The fleet had 2 options: compress the operational tempo to reduce consumption, or split the convoy route into multiple smaller threads to reduce interdiction risk. The math on both options was provided. The scenario asked cadets to recommend a course of action. The Drevithi pair went first. They chose tempo compression, citing the mathematical reduction in consumption rate. Their logic was clean. The Sketh cadet chose route fragmentation, arguing that interdiction risk was the binding constraint and fragmentation reduced it structurally. Also clean. 3 more cadets offered variants on these 2 positions, each with slight adjustments to the assumptions. Dace turned to Marcus. "Cadet Reyes." "Neither," Marcus said. The room registered this in various species-specific ways: a slight luminescence shift in the Drevithi pair, a postural adjustment from the Sketh, a brief synchronization pause from the Orani cluster. Dace tilted his head. "Explain." "Both options assume the convoy schedule problem is the primary constraint. But the scenario tells us the route degradation and interdiction pressure are concurrent. That's unusual. Route degradation takes time, it's environmental or infrastructural. Interdiction is deliberate. If both are happening simultaneously, we're probably looking at a coordinated pressure campaign, not 2 independent problems. Someone wants this fleet stationary." Dace said nothing. "So the logistics question isn't really a logistics question," Marcus continued. "It's an intelligence question. Before we decide how to manage the supply chain, We need to know whether the degradation is natural or induced. If it's induced, both options fail. Tempo compression makes us a predictable target, and route fragmentation with compromised intelligence just gives the interdiction force more vectors to hit. The right answer is to hold position, run a short-cycle reconnaissance effort on the degraded routes, and withhold the convoy decision until we understand what we're actually dealing with. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. Dace walked to his display and brought up a secondary data panel that had not been part of the original scenario. It showed sensor logs from the degraded routes, logs that, if examined carefully, showed a subtle pattern inconsistent with natural degradation. This was embedded in the scenario materials, Dace said. It was accessible to anyone who looked for it. No one looked. He closed the panel. Cadet Reyes identified the correct diagnostic question without accessing the additional data. He reasoned to it from the structural anomaly of concurrent pressures. He paused. This is what field command looks like when it functions properly. Not the correct answer. The correct question. He moved on to the next scenario. Marcus stood in his spot near the back of the room, feeling the shift in the way his classmates held their postures when they stood near him. It was subtle. He'd felt it before in other rooms on other assignments. It was the particular way people recalibrated when they realized the quiet one had been paying a different kind of attention. He didn't particularly enjoy the attention, but he didn't resist it either. After the seminar, Professor Dace passed him in the corridor without stopping and said, without looking at him, "Your supply chain optimization commendation. What did you actually do?" "Frontier posting," Marcus said. "We were running medical resupply to 4 stations that shared one convoy window. 2 of the stations had conflicting priority classifications that created a recurring bottleneck. I found that the classification system was using outdated population data. Updated the data, reprioritized dynamically, cleared the bottleneck." Dace walked on. 2 days later, Marcus found a supplementary reading list in his academic queue. It was not assigned to the rest of the cohort. It contained 7 monographs on adaptive logistics doctrine, 2 of which were authored by Dace himself and not publicly available. Marcus read all 7 before the next seminar. The mid-semester fleet command exercise was the event every cadet prepared for and no one felt prepared for. It was run in the Academy Simulation Complex, a facility that consumed an entire deck of Verith Station, filled with haptic interface terminals, 3-dimensional tactical displays, and the particular kind of controlled atmospheric pressure that made everything feel slightly more serious than it was. Each cadet was assigned a command role in a simulated engagement scenario. The scenarios were drawn from historical engagements with modified variables, so direct historical knowledge was useful but not sufficient. Marcus was assigned as Fleet Coordination Officer, a mid-tier command role responsible for synchronizing the movements of 3 separate task groups under a simulated admiral played by one of the senior instructors. It was not the most visible role. The cadets assigned as task group commanders received the most direct instructor attention and most of the post-exercise debrief focus. The scenario was a contested withdrawal under pursuit pressure, a historically common and theoretically difficult problem, because withdrawal required the simultaneous management of speed, formation integrity, and rearguard engagement, all of which pulled against each other. For the first 40 minutes, the exercise proceeded approximately as the instructors expected. The task group commanders made reasonable decisions. The simulated admiral issued orders at appropriate intervals. The withdrawal was slow but functional. Then the simulation introduced a complication. One of the 3 task groups suffered a simulated drive failure that reduced its maximum speed by 30%. This was not in the scenario brief. It was an injected variable deliberately introduced to stress test adaptability. What followed was the part that Professor Amiris, who was observing from the monitoring station, later described in his evaluation report as the most compact demonstration of command integration I have observed in 14 years of running this exercise. The task group commanders each began adapting their individual groups to the new reality, which was the correct instinct but produced a fragmented response. 3 separate local optimizations that were individually reasonable but collectively incoherent. The compromised group was slowing. The other 2 groups were beginning to pull ahead. The formation was starting to stretch. Marcus, from his fleet coordination terminal, did not issue a recommendation to the simulated admiral. He issued 4 simultaneous coordination signals, 1 to each task group commander and 1 to the simulated admiral, each phrased differently, each containing one specific piece of information the recipient needed, each arriving within the same 3-second window. To the admiral, the formation is beginning to separate, Recommend immediate speed cap on all groups to maintain cohesion. To task Group 1, adjust bearing by 7 degrees, you are beginning to create a gap on the compromised group's flank. To task Group 3, reduce speed to match the compromised group's current maximum, you will be in a position to provide rear coverage from that bearing. To task Group 2, which contain the compromised ships, maintain current heading, you have coverage forming on both flanks, do not attempt compensating maneuvers. All 4 signals arrived before the instructors in the monitoring station had finished discussing how to respond to the complication. The simulated admiral, played by an instructor who had run this scenario dozens of times, accepted the recommendations without modification and issued the corresponding orders. The formation stabilized. The withdrawal continued, slower but intact. The exercise concluded 30 minutes later with a successful extraction. In the debrief, the instructors worked through each decision point methodically. When they reached the drive failure response, Professor Sovari, who had been observing alongside Emiris, pulled up the timestamp on Marcus's 4 signals. These were issued simultaneously, she said to the room. Fleet Coordination issued 4 targeted differentiated signals to 4 different parties within a 3-second window, before any party had transmitted a response to the complication. She looked at Marcus. Walk us through your decision process. He thought about how to explain it simply. When the drive failure appeared, I didn't think about it as a problem with one ship. I thought about it as a new constraint on the entire formation. A formation is a relationship between moving objects. Change the speed capability of one object and the relationships all have to change. I just worked out what each relationship needed to look like and communicated the specific piece of each answer to the person who needed it. In 3 seconds, Professor Sovari said. I'd been monitoring the formation throughout the exercise, he said. I wasn't starting from zero. She nodded slowly. Emiris made a note on his evaluation slate. The note read, not instinct. Architecture. This cadet maintains a continuous running model of the situation and updates it in real time. The response was fast because the preparation was constant. He underlined constant. The Academy's academic year required each cadet to submit a theoretical paper in their second semester. The paper was expected to make an original contribution to the field. Not a literature review, not a position paper, but an actual argument about how something in multi-species command doctrine should be understood differently. Most cadets spent months on theirs. The Orani cadet cluster produced a collaborative piece on consensus command efficiency that ran to 40 pages and cited 200 sources. The Drevithi pair submitted separate papers that turned out to be secretly complementary, which their advisor called elegant and their peers called unsettling. Marcus submitted a 31-page paper titled Command Authority as an Information System. Why Doctrine Conflates Leadership with Rank. The abstract was 5 sentences. The argument was simple on its surface and grew more uncomfortable the deeper you read. Most multi-species command doctrine conflated formal rank authority with functional command capability. These were not the same thing, and treating them as the same thing was responsible for a recurring class of command failures that the field had consistently misattributed to communication problems, cultural incompatibility, or individual officer failure. Real command authority, Marcus argued, was not a title. It was the demonstrated capacity to receive, integrate, and act on information faster than the situation degraded. Rank was a useful proxy for this capacity in peacetime and a potentially lethal fiction in combat. He documented 9 historical cases, all from the consortium's own archives, where formal rank authority and functional command capability had diverged, and traced the specific decision point failures that resulted. He submitted it on the deadline. Not early. Not late. Professor Sovari received it as his primary academic advisor. She read it once quickly, set it aside, then picked it up again 2 days later and read it slowly, making notes in the margin of her own copy. She flagged it for peer review by 2 faculty members outside her own department, a methodological requirement she reserved for papers she considered above the threshold of routine assessment. It was the first time in 3 years she had invoked that process for a cadet paper. The peer reviewers were Professor Dace and an external scholar named Ferris Call, a retired Orani fleet admiral who consulted for the Academy's Curriculum Development Board. Neither was told who had written it before submitting their initial evaluation. Dace's evaluation was 4 paragraphs. The core of it, the historical case analysis, is rigorous. The theoretical framework is not novel in its individual components but is novel in its synthesis. The argument about rank as proxy is uncomfortable because it is accurate, and the discomfort is not a reason to dismiss it. Recommend publication in the Consortium Academic Review with minor revisions. Ferris Call's evaluation was 2 sentences. I have spent 60 years in Fleet Command and read this paper twice. Recommend immediate publication and curriculum integration. When Sovari called Marcus into her office to discuss the reviews, she set both evaluations on the desk without comment and let him read them. He read both. His expression didn't change much. There was a brief stillness that she had come to recognize as his version of processing something significant. Ferris Call, he said. He commanded the Verith defense during the second incursion. He did. Marcus set the evaluations down. The rank versus capability argument. He lived it in that campaign. He has not said so publicly, Sovari said. But yes. I believe that is why his evaluation was 2 sentences. He recognized something. She paused. I owe you a revision of my initial assessment, she said. Marcus looked at her. You assessed based on available evidence, he said. That's all anyone can do. She found, to her own slight surprise, that she had no rebuttal to this. 6 months into the academic year, the incident at Jural Post intruded on the controlled environment of the academy like weather through a poorly sealed viewport. Jural Post was a consortium frontier station in a contested sector, not technically at war with anyone, but in the kind of ongoing low-level pressure environment that the consortium's diplomatic language called elevated tension, and everyone else called something more honest. It served as a refueling and coordination point for 6 different patrol fleets from 4 species, including a rotating element from the Sol Defense Forces. The incident, as it came to be called in dispatches, began as a miscommunication and escalated to something considerably more serious in approximately 90 minutes. A Drevithi patrol element, believing it had received authorization from Jural Post's command authority, executed a route incursion into a sector nominally held by the Kaith sovereignty. A non-consortium polity with extremely precise territorial sensitivities and a documented history of treating unauthorized incursions as acts of aggression. By the time the error was identified, the Drevithi patrol was deep in Kaith space, a Kaith response force was vectoring toward them, and Jural Post's senior officer was issuing 3 different contradictory orders across 2 communication channels. The Academy received a real-time intelligence feed of the incident because 2 of its faculty members were serving as curriculum advisors aboard Jural Post at the time. The feed was not classified, it was part of the Academy's standard operational awareness integration, designed to bring real-world events into the academic environment. Professor Sovari opened the feed to the cohort as a live case study. 30 cadets gathered in the main seminar room, watching the situation unfold on the tactical display with the uncomfortable awareness that this was not a simulation. The consequences were real. The Drevithi patrol had approximately 40 crew members. The Kaith response force had 3 times their mass and combined tonnage. The room was quiet and tense in the way rooms become when everyone is thinking hard and no one is sure thinking is enough. Marcus stood near the display. He'd been there for 6 minutes before anyone noticed he was analyzing something specific. The Kaith response formation, he said not loudly to no one in particular. Look at the approach geometry. Sovari looked. They're not on an intercept vector, Marcus said. They're on a parallel vector with a convergence angle of about 12 degrees. At current speeds, they'll reach maximum engagement range at the same time as the Drevithi patrol reaches the sector boundary. He traced the lines with his finger without touching the display. If the Drevithi patrol maintains speed and heading, the Kaith ships achieve maximum weapons range at the exact moment the patrol crosses back into neutral space. A cadet behind him said, that means they're not trying to catch them. They're trying to catch them at the boundary, Marcus said. An incursion that ends in neutral space doesn't justify a response under Kaith territorial law. An engagement that begins while the intruder is still technically in their space does. They're not chasing. They're timing. Sovari was already on a secondary communicator. She reached one of the faculty advisors aboard Jural Post within 40 seconds. The information was relayed to Jural Post's command within 2 minutes. The Drevithi patrol was instructed to increase speed by 18%, enough to cross the boundary before the Kaith formation achieved the geometry it needed. The Kaith ships held at the boundary for 11 minutes, then withdrew. No engagement occurred. In the debrief that followed, Sovari did not make Marcus the center of the discussion. She was careful about that, careful not to create a narrative that flattened a complex situation into a single hero. The faculty advisors on site had made critical decisions. Jural Post's command had acted on incomplete information and then updated appropriately when better information arrived. But in her private log that evening, she wrote 3 words under Marcus Reyes's name. EC Systems. 3 weeks before the end of the academic year, the Academy received an unusual request. A delegation from the Seoul Defense Forces Joint Command, 5 officers, senior grades, traveling under a schedule that the Academy's administrative staff described as flexible but purposeful, asked to sit in on several advanced seminars. Delegations visited occasionally. It was not unusual in itself. What was unusual was that their visit had been coordinated through channels that bypassed the Academy's standard scheduling process, that their formal request specified 3 seminars by course code rather than by professor name, and that 2 of the 5 officers were from Fleet Intelligence rather than the conventional command track. Professor Sovari learned this from the administrative coordinator, who mentioned it because the coordinators had found the request slightly irregular and weren't certain how to classify it in the records. Sovari had learned, over a long career, to pay attention to slightly irregular things. She reviewed the 3 requested seminars. All 3 were courses in which Marcus Reyes was enrolled. She did not say anything to Marcus. She made a note and watched. The delegation attended the first seminar, DACE's logistics session, and sat in the back row with the posture of people who were trying to observe without appearing to observe. They asked no questions. They made notes on physical paper rather than data slates, which Sovari noticed and filed away. In the seminar, DACE ran a compression scenario, a fleet attempting to execute a full operational resupply in a compressed timeline under simulated hostile pressure. Marcus, when called on, produced an answer that involved a dynamic prioritization matrix he'd apparently built independently, outside of coursework, to model resupply decision trees under varying threat conditions. DACE asked him to explain it. He explained it in 4 minutes. It was clear, structured, and revealed that he had been refining the model for several weeks based on historical case data. The 2 fleet intelligence officers in the back row stopped writing. After the seminar, one of them, a Commander Veth, according to the delegation's credentials, a compact woman with the particular stillness that Sovari associated with people who processed information very quickly and said very little, approached DACE in the corridor. Sovari was near enough to hear the exchange. The prioritization model Reyes described, Commander Veth said. Has he submitted it anywhere formally? Not to my knowledge, DACE said. Is it his own design? I asked him that last week, DACE said. He said he built it because the existing frameworks weren't giving him what he needed for the scenario work. Veth made a note on her paper. What he needed for course exercises. Yes, DACE said. Veth was quiet for a moment. We've had analysts working on the same category of problem for 8 months, she said. The approach is different but the underlying logic is similar. He got to a comparable structure independently. DACE said nothing. In his spare time, Veth said. For coursework. She thanked him and walked back to the delegation. That evening, Sovari received a formal communication from Seoul Defense Forces Joint Command. It was brief and used the kind of language that meant something specific to people who had received such communications before. It requested that Marcus Reyes be made available for an interview at his earliest convenience. Sovari requested clarification of the purpose. The response came from a level above the original signatory. The purpose, it said, was to discuss his academic work and potential applications in an operational context. She read the message twice. Then she filed a note in her records under Marcus Reyes's intake assessment, the one she had written at the beginning of the year, the one that noted average scores and a middle-of-cohort profile. She did not delete the original assessment. She added a single line to it, initial assessment incomplete. Evidence has not converged on a ceiling. The interview was not held in a conference room. It was held aboard a Seoul Defense Forces vessel, the SDF Meridian, a command ship of a class that was not widely discussed in public fleet records, which had docked at Verith Station under a logistics cover that was technically accurate and contextually understated. Marcus was escorted aboard by Commander Veth, who had not spoken more than 40 words to him before the door to the ship's command briefing room closed behind them. Inside, seated at a table in a room that was smaller and more functional than its importance warranted, were 4 people. Admiral Sarah Kane, Joint Fleet Command, Seoul Defense Forces. A woman in her mid-60s whose reputation Marcus knew from the historical record of the Outer Belt Coordination Campaign, the engagement that had ended a 14-year border conflict through a logistics strategy so precise that the opposing command had, according to declassified accounts, briefly believed they were facing a different species entirely. 2 officers Marcus didn't recognize, both from the intelligence track, both with the particular kind of stillness that Veth had. And a 4th person, not in uniform, seated slightly apart from the others, whose identification panel read Ferris Call, Civilian Advisor. Marcus stood at the threshold for a moment. Ferris Call, the retired admiral, the man who had written the two-sentence review of his paper, looked exactly like his service record photos, which were 30 years old. He was very still and very attentive and had the look of someone who had spent a career learning to see things quickly. "Sit down, cadet," Admiral Kane said. He sat. What followed was 2 hours and 40 minutes of the most demanding conversation of Marcus Reyes's life, and he had had some demanding conversations. They worked through his paper, not the broad argument but the 9 historical cases, one by one, pushing on his methodology, his source interpretation, his conclusions. He held most of them. He conceded 2 points where the evidence was thinner than he'd indicated and said so directly, which produced a brief pause in the questioning each time. They moved to the Jurel Post incident. He walked through his geometric analysis of the Kth response formation, step by step. One of the intelligence officers pulled up a sensor reconstruction and asked him to identify from the data the point at which the Kth formation had committed to its timing strategy. He identified it. The officer confirmed the timestamp against a classified analysis that had taken a 4-person team 3 days to produce. Marcus had identified it in real time from a live tactical feed in a classroom. They asked about the prioritization model, the one he'd built for Dace's coursework. He explained the architecture, the decision logic, the constraint hierarchy. One of the intelligence officers asked a technical question about how the model handled cascading failures across multiple supply nodes simultaneously. He talked through it for 12 minutes. Kane stopped him. "You built this for a class exercise," she said. "The class scenario required it," he said. "The existing frameworks weren't granular enough." "The existing frameworks," she said, "are what we currently use for operational fleet resupply planning at the theater level." He absorbed this. "Then you might want to update them," he said. Ferris Call made a sound that might have been a laugh. Kane looked at Marcus for a long moment. Then she opened a folder on the table, physical paper like Veth's notes, and slid a document across to him. It was a commission proposal. The specific role it described did not exist yet. It outlined a position attached to Joint Fleet Command Strategic Integration Division, focusing on multi-species command architecture, essentially the practical application of the argument he had made in his paper. The role carried a rank that was, for someone his age and profile, unusual. Not unprecedented. Unusual. He read it carefully. All of it. Including the parts that described the operational environments he would be working in, which were described in the careful language of official documents and were clearly more dangerous than they sounded. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Kane. "Can I ask something?" "Yes." "Professor Sovari's initial assessment of me was that I was unremarkable," he said. "Based on my entrance scores. She wasn't wrong to make that assessment. The evidence supported it." Kane waited. "What changed?" he asked. "What specifically made you look?" Kane glanced at Ferris Call. Call leaned forward slightly. "Your paper," he said. "The rank versus capability argument. I've known that distinction my entire career. I've never seen anyone write it down as a theoretical claim and prove it rigorously with archival evidence. Most people who understand it intuitively don't have the analytical framework to formalize it. Most people who have the analytical framework don't have enough operational intuition to recognize it in the first place." He paused. "You've been in both places simultaneously," he said. "That's what changed." Marcus looked at the document again. "The existing frameworks," he said. "The resupply model. If I take this role, I'd want to actually fix them. Not as a side project. As the primary work." "That's the intent," Kane said. "And the multi-species command architecture problem, the one from my paper. There are 8 active consortium joint operations running right now that have the same structural vulnerability I documented in the historical cases." "We know," said one of the intelligence officers. It was the first time either of them had spoken. "Then that's urgent," Marcus said. "Yes," said Kane. "It is." He looked at the document one more time. Then he picked up the authorization pen that had been placed beside it, also physical, also deliberate, and signed. Outside the Meridian, Verith Station continued its rotation. In the Academy's seminar rooms, the cohort was preparing for final assessments. Professor Sovari was reviewing evaluation criteria. Professor Dace was designing next semester's opening scenario. The stars held their positions. Marcus Reyes had been assessed as unremarkable by someone doing their job correctly with incomplete information, at the beginning of a year in which the information became complete. He was not bitter about the initial assessment. It had been accurate as far as it went. What it had failed to account for was not hidden genius or secret brilliance. It was simpler than that and harder to measure. He had been paying a different kind of attention than the metrics were designed to detect. And he had been doing it constantly, in every room from the first day. That was all. And it turned out to be enough.